In the summer of 1900, a dying empire did something almost absurd. It declared war on the 11 most powerful nations on Earth. That war led to a 55-day siege, the fall of a 500-year-old capital, and the end of 2,000 years of imperial rule. But the disaster that reshaped the world did not begin in the imperial palace. It began on a field of cracked, rainless farmland, and with a starving farmer named Li. That is all we know of him. Just Li. North China, 1900. The yellow earth had split open like shattered pottery. Rivers had shrunk to muddy trickles. Li's family had tilled this land for generations. His father, his grandfather, and his father before that. It was never rich, but it always gave just enough. Enough to pay the rent, enough to keep them alive. But that year, the earth gave nothing. The granary was empty. So were the neighbors. Across the entire North China plain, millions of farmers faced the same choice: stay and starve, or leave and take their chances. Many left, becoming aimless refugees on the dusty roads. But Li stayed, not because he was brave, but because he had no idea what he would be if he left this cracked soil behind. On the edge of Li's village stood a building he had never seen before. It was made of stone, not the mud brick houses of his people. It had a pointed spire and stained glass windows. Inside, a foreign priest in a black robe preached about a god Li had never heard of. Missionaries had come to China centuries earlier, but in the decades before 1900, their numbers had exploded. They built churches, schools, hospitals, and thousands of Chinese converted to their faith. For some, these foreigners brought help, medicine, education, a different way of seeing the world. But for Li and his neighbors, they brought something else: confusion. Why had these outsiders come so far? Why did they make people abandon the gods of their ancestors? And when the land was dry and the people were starving, why did the stone church still stand untouched? Foreigners were nothing new. For decades, European powers had carved China into spheres of influence. Britain on the Yangtze, Russia in the north and northwest, Germany in Shandong, France in the southwest. They built railways, opened ports, demanded trading rights. To the powers, this was business. To farmers like Li, it felt like their world was being slowly strangled. Then, whispers began in the village. People spoke of a secret society, a movement to drive out the foreigners. They called themselves the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. The world would know them as the Boxers. At night, they gathered in the fields, burning incense and chanting spells. They believed that the spirits of ancient warriors would possess them, making them invulnerable to bullets and blades. They wrapped red cloth around their heads and carried broadswords, spears, and torches. Their banners read, "Support the Qing, exterminate the foreigners." To Li, these men were not strangers. They were his neighbors, his cousins, perhaps even his own son. They were farmers who had lost everything, grasping for a way to turn back time, to bring the gods back to their side. But the heavens remained silent. The rain did not come. 300 miles to the north, in the forbidden city of Beijing, another decision was being made. Empress Dowager Cixi, the de facto ruler of China, sat in her candlelit hall, surrounded by her ministers. She had ruled for decades from behind a curtain, presiding over one child emperor after another. The current emperor, Guangxu, was her nephew. She had raised him like a son. In 1898, he had tried to reform the military, education, and government, the 100 Days Reform. But Cixi stopped him. She placed him under house arrest on an island in the Palace Lake. She believed power could not be shared. She also believed the empire could not survive upheaval. Too much change, too fast, would tear the vast country apart. Now, a document was placed before her. It was said to be a note from the foreign powers, demanding she return real authority to the imprisoned emperor. Whether that note was genuine or forged, historians still debate. But either way, the effect was the same. It enraged her. She would be dictated to by no one, neither foreigners nor anyone else. But in the dead of night, alone with the flickering candles, did she feel fear? Not of losing power, but of how history would remember her if the empire crumbled in her hands. On the 17th of June 1900, foreign warships appeared off the Chinese coast, targeting the Dagu forts, the coastal batteries guarding the gateway to Beijing. The ships belonged to an 8-nation alliance: Britain, the United States, Japan, Russia, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. Their stated mission: to protect their diplomats and citizens in the capital. They opened fire. The Chinese gunners fought back with everything they had, loading their antiquated cannons and firing at the ironclads. But their weapons were no match for modern naval artillery. Within hours, the forts fell. Foreign troops climbed over the shattered walls, and 8 flags rose above Dagu. The road to Beijing lay open. On June 21, Cixi, in the name of the young emperor, issued an imperial edict. It called upon all Chinese to defend their country. It condemned the arrogance of the foreigners, praised China's moral righteousness, and invoked the spirits of the ancestors and the will of heaven. For more than a century, historians have called it a declaration of war against 11 nations. But the truth is more complex. The edict was addressed to the Chinese government, not to foreign governments. No foreign embassy ever received an official copy. It was more a mobilization order than a diplomatic note. But whatever its legal nature, the effect was the same. It told the world that China would fight. To the powers, this was an act of war. To the farmer Li, it was just a distant voice from a world he could not see, issuing orders he could not understand. But in the southern provinces, things were very different. The southern governors, like Liu Kunyi of Liangjiang, Zhang Zhidong of Huguang, and Li Hongjiang of Guangdong, upon receiving the edict, made a stunning decision. They refused to obey. In secret negotiations with foreign consuls, they promised to protect all foreigners and foreign property in the south. In exchange, the powers agreed not to attack the south. This became known as the mutual protection of the southeast. An invisible line now ran across China, on no map, but real in every way. To the north, war raged. To the south, life went on as usual. Shanghai's shops stayed open, and foreign banks on the Bund continued to trade. China was nominally one empire. In reality, it had become 2 worlds. In Beijing, the foreign diplomats and their families withdrew into the legation quarter, a walled compound in the heart of the city. They were surrounded. Outside the walls, tens of thousands of boxers and Qing troops massed for the attack. The siege lasted 55 days. Inside the quarter, about 3,500 foreigners and Chinese Christians waited for relief. They built sandbag fortifications, rationed food and water, and beat back wave after wave of assaults. Outside, the attackers were a ragged mix: boxers with swords and spears, Qing soldiers with outdated rifles, local militias with whatever weapons they could find. The weapons were a study in obsolescence. Some soldiers carried tai tsang, long, heavy matchlocks that required 2 men to operate, one to hold the barrel, one to ignite the charge. They were designs centuries old. The defenders had modern rifles and machine guns. They were vastly outnumbered, but far better armed. The siege became a strange paradox. Chinese forces besieging foreign embassies in their own capital, while a relief column was already forming that would crush them and occupy Beijing. Even stranger, in the midst of the cannon fire, vendors still delivered fresh vegetables to the embassy gates. War was war, but business was business. The siege dragged on, and the Eight-Nation Alliance assembled on the coast. Their advance force numbered about 30,000, growing to more than 50,000 by the time they reached Beijing. The Japanese contingent was the largest. They pushed along the railway from Tianjin to Beijing, the very railway that foreign engineers had built, and that now served as their invasion route. At Langfang, the Qing army tried to stop them. They fought bravely, but against modern artillery and machine guns, their old weapons were useless. The alliance broke through, captured Tianjin, and marched straight for the capital. On the 14th of August, 1900, they arrived at the gates of Beijing. The gates were breached. Foreign soldiers poured into the city. Beijing had fallen. And in the fields south of the city, Li was trying to harvest what little remained of his crops. Or rather, he was trying. In the distance, he heard the rumble of artillery. Not scattered shots, but a continuous, dull thunder rolling from the direction of the capital. He stopped, sickle in hand, and looked north. He did not know what was happening, but he knew that something had ended. On the day the city fell, Cixi did something she had never done before. She removed her imperial robes and dressed in coarse cotton like a peasant woman. She climbed onto a humble mule cart, not the grand imperial carriage, but the kind used by farmers and merchants. With a small retinue of guards, she fled the capital. The road was rough. The cart jolted over stones and ruts. The most powerful woman in China tossed about on wooden planks like any other refugee. Her destination was Xi'an, an ancient city more than 1,000 kilometers away. It would take months to get there. As she fled, foreign soldiers marched into the forbidden city. They passed through gates that no foreign army had ever crossed in 500 years. They stood before the dragon throne, where the Son of Heaven had once sat. The old order was collapsing, and at that very moment, on a dusty country road, the mule cart passed a farmer. Li stood at the edge of his field, watching the worn-out cart approach from the east and then fade westward. Inside sat an old woman in gray cloth, her face haggard. Li had no idea who she was. All he knew was that the person in that cart, like him, was running for her life. The highest ruler and the lowest peasant, on the same dirt road, fleeing toward the same distant horizon. They never looked at each other. The old order was collapsing. And in that broken land, for one fleeting instant, the fates of the rich and the poor had never been so alike. On the 7th of September, 1901, a treaty was signed in Beijing. Its formal title was the Final Protocol for the Settlement of the Disturbances of 1900, a grand name that masked its true nature. In reality, it was a peace treaty imposed by the victors on the vanquished. The signatories were China and 11 nations: Britain, the United States, Japan, Russia, France, Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Spain, and the Netherlands. The terms were crushing. China was to pay an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, roughly one tael for every Chinese citizen. It was to be repaid over 39 years with interest, bringing the total to 980 million taels, more than 12 years' worth of the Qing government's entire annual revenue. This was not just a payment, it was a humiliation. Every one of the 450 million Chinese, including the dead, was now footing the bill for this war. For the farmer Li, the treaty meant nothing. He never heard of it. What he did know was that the taxes had gone up again. The grain collector came, demanding more than ever before. And his son had been taken away to build a railway, the very railway that led to the sea, built by foreign supervisors, laid by Chinese labor. He stood on the cracked edge of his field, staring south, where there was no thunder of guns and no redemption. The old minister, Li Hongzhang, who had negotiated the treaty, signed it with trembling hands. 2 months later, he was dead. He did not die of old age. He died of a debt that could never be counted. But the indemnity was not the only price. As the alliance marched on Beijing, Russia had taken advantage of the chaos to move 170,000 troops into Manchuria, the vast northeastern region of China. They occupied towns and villages, expelled Chinese officials, and seized railways and mines. In the process, at Blagoveshchensk and across the Amur River, they committed atrocities. Thousands of Chinese civilians were driven into the river and drowned. But Russia's expansion into Manchuria alarmed another rising power, Japan. In 1904, the Russo-Japanese War broke out on Chinese soil. From Port Arthur to Mukden, on land and sea, hundreds of thousands of soldiers died, and Chinese civilians were caught in the middle. Japan won, but the cost was borne by the people of that land, farmers like Li, who had no say in any of it. And what did all of this mean? For the farmer Li, it meant hunger, displacement, and the disappearance of the world he had known. For the Qing Empire, it meant the beginning of the end. The old order had been shaken to its roots. 10 years later, in 1911, revolution erupted. The imperial system that had ruled China for more than 2,000 years collapsed. And for the world, it was a warning. After 1900, the powers accelerated their arms race. Navies expanded, armies grew, alliances hardened. The competition for colonies and influence grew more intense. In 1914, the war that everyone had feared finally came. The First World War claimed millions of lives. And many of those tensions had their roots in places like China, where the scramble for advantage had been rehearsed. Today, Li's village is gone. The cracked earth has been covered by roads and buildings. The church at the edge of the village, if it still stands, is just another old building in a crowded landscape. But the earth remembers, not like a person with dates, names, and words. It remembers in another way. It remembers the footprints of farmers who no longer walk its surface. It remembers the bones buried in shallow graves. It remembers the silence that followed the gunfire. The ancient capital has long been rebuilt. Skyscrapers now stand where the city walls once stood. The Forbidden City is a museum, welcoming tourists from around the world. But when you pass through those gates, you pass through the place where an empire ended. Stones do not speak, but they hold memory. History does not repeat itself, but it echoes. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of that distant summer when the earth cracked, the farmers starved, and the world came to China with fire, iron, and transformation. And the farmer named Li, his name is carved on no stone. He left no diary, no photograph. He was one of the millions of nameless ones, and yet it is they, not the emperors and generals, who carry the heaviest weight of history. The earth remembers. The earth is silent. And silence, sometimes, more than any sound, lasts the longest.